You picture the Middle Ages as nights and feasts, but most people were freezing, sick, and squatting over a hole in the floor, praying the moss they found wouldn't tear their skin. No toilets, no privacy, just a dark corner, a draft, and a handful of straw already used by someone else. Netflix won't show you this because the real medieval war wasn't fought with swords, it was fought on the toilet. Let's say you're lucky enough to be born a noble. You don't toil in the fields, you don't beg for bread. You live in a castle, a massive stone structure that looks impressive from the outside. But step inside, and the fantasy crumbles fast. Your bathroom isn't a room at all. It's a narrow stone bench with a hole carved into it, suspended high above a pit that hasn't been emptied in months. There's no flush, no water basin, no soap. Just drafty walls, the constant stench of rot, and the sound of yesterday's dinner splashing somewhere deep below. The smell never leaves. Not your clothes, not your nose, not your skin. The chill in the air, that's not weather. It's the icy breath, that's the icy breath of an unwashed world. And here's the part they really don't put in the history books. You're not just dealing with filth. You're dealing with a body that has no mercy, leaking, bleeding, convulsing, especially when there's no hygiene, no treatment, and no understanding of what's going on inside. For women, this meant navigating menstruation with nothing but rags. If that, many reused them until they dissolved into disease, rotted cloth. And then came the sickness. It started small, a little itching, a bit of bloating. Then the worms came. Intestinal parasites were so common that they had nicknames, the devil's threads. Children screamed through the night, convulsing as roundworms crawled inside them. Grown men tore at their bellies, convinced they were possessed. Dysentery was everywhere. People shat themselves to death, slowly dehydrating, hallucinating, mumbling nonsense, while lying in piles of their own waste. Some clawed at their skin until it bled. Others tore out their hair. The body collapsed from the inside, intestines inflamed, fevers raging, mouths foaming, and all because someone didn't wash their hands after wiping with straw. But the most disturbing part? They thought it was normal. The smell of bad blood was considered a sign of sin. If your breath stank of iron and your skin turned gray, it meant you were cursed, or worse, touched by the devil himself. Doctors bled people just to let the stink out. Priests performed minor exorcisms to cleanse women who bled for too long, or children who trembled in the night from parasitic fever. You think you've had a bad bathroom experience? Try relieving yourself while a gust of wind shoots up from a pit of human waste and punches you in the face like a warm, fermented fist. Try cleaning yourself with a handful of straw that's already been used. Try squatting over a communal hole during a harsh winter and realizing there's nothing left but snow and your own hand. And God help you if you slipped. Today, you complain when the toilet paper isn't soft enough. And if you think that's bad, trust me, we're just getting started. So, with all that filth, all that cold, and all that raw exposure to your own biology, what did people actually use to wipe? The short answer, anything. Long answer, everything you wouldn't want anywhere near your body. In the warmer months, if the gods smiled on you, and the forest hadn't been stripped bare, you might get lucky with a broadleaf, a patch of moss soft enough not to tear skin, or tall grass that hadn't yet been pissed on by a passing animal. These weren't supplies. These were acts of survival. And even then, they came with risk. Sharp stems, insect eggs, rotting bark, thorns. Some used feathers, plucked from dead birds, lice still wriggling in the shaft. They didn't disinfect them. They didn't boil them. They just wiped and moved on. But most didn't have feathers or grass. or anything resembling comfort. When nothing else was available, and that was often, you used your hand. That was the default. You squatted, wiped with your palm, and maybe rinsed it in a shared bucket afterward. Maybe. Most just wiped it on their tunic, or rubbed it against the wall, or didn't wipe at all. The stains on medieval clothing weren't fashion statements. They were biohazards. And winter? Winter was an entirely different beast. In the bitter months, everything froze. Your fingers, your feet, the pit, your breath. And so people turned to snow. Yes, snow. You packed it tight and braced for contact. An icy explosion against skin already chapped and cracked from cold. If you held it too long, it burned. If you pressed too hard, it bled. And if you didn't wipe at all, it crusted and dried and stayed there, frozen shame under layers of wool and wood smoke. But the ancient world had solutions too. Terrible, brilliant, horrifying solutions. In Greece and Rome, public toilets weren't private stalls. They were stone benches with holes, side by side, no dividers, no shame. And when you were done, you reached for ostraka, small, flat shards of broken pottery, stored in a communal bowl by the door. You grabbed one, scraped yourself, and dropped it back in the bowl. Repeat. Next person. Yes, people cleaned themselves with sharp ceramic tiles. And yes, people bled. Records survive of soldiers slicing themselves so badly during latrine duty that they bled out in the trench, their bodies discovered later by the stench. Even worse, the Roman sponge. A sea sponge tied to a stick, stored in a communal bucket of vinegar. It was supposed to be disinfected. It wasn't. Vinegar diluted by use, the bucket never changed, the sponge never cleaned. You'd grab it, wipe, rinse it back in the bucket, and hundreds of people, one sponge, shared bacteria for entire cities. And if you think that's revolting, just wait, because while peasants were out here wiping with straw and snow, up in the palaces, things weren't much better. They just looked cleaner on the surface, but underneath, the same filth, the same bodies, the same desperate, disease-ridden rituals, just hidden behind silk curtains and golden chamber pots. There was no toilet paper. There was no clean. Now, you'd think all this misery was reserved for peasants. Those barefoot, nameless bodies squatting in the dirt and praying they don't catch the next parasite. But filth didn't discriminate by rank. Because even in the royal chambers, even behind walls gilded with gold and tapestries stitched in silk, there was one thing no crown could escape: the need to shit. And here, in the very heart of power, is where it gets truly bizarre. Because the King of England, ruler of armies, supreme head of church and state, didn't just have a throne, he had a toilet throne. A wooden chair with a velvet-cushioned hole, perched above a gilded chamber pot, tucked behind silk curtains, and attended by a man whose title was somehow both ridiculous and terrifying. Groom of the Stool. Yes, it was real. Yes, it was prestigious. And yes, this man's job was to personally assist the king during every bowel movement, from preparation to wiping to, if needed, emotional support. But here's where it turns from weird to dangerous. The groom wasn't some servant hiding in the shadows. He was a high-ranking noble, often of aristocratic blood, granted direct, uninterrupted access to the king's most vulnerable moments, physically, politically, psychologically. Because when you're the only person allowed in the room while a monarch is bent over a steaming pot, grunting through gout and constipation, you hear things, you gain trust. And trust, in a world of daggers and whispers, was worth more than gold. This wasn't just wiping, this was power. The groom reviewed correspondence, advised on treasury matters, scheduled meetings, and sometimes, yes, seriously, controlled who had access to the king. Imagine that. The man cleaning the royal ass also managed royal appointments. And sometimes, he did both at once. One day, he's inspecting linen cloths. The next, he's influencing foreign policy. Sir William Compton, for example, groom of the stool to Henry VIII, held immense control over the king's daily access, finances, and moods. And all of it began with a bowel movement. Meanwhile, peasants were wiping themselves with sticks, getting dysentery, and dying in ditches. But inside the palace, the guy holding the chamber pot was quietly running the kingdom from behind the curtain, a curtain that reeked of sweat, piss, and secrets. There is no greater metaphor for medieval power than this. The man who held the cloth also held the crown. Because when the throne is made of wood and the politics happen during wiping, it's not just a title, it's a system. And sometimes, the most powerful place in the empire is one breath away from the royal ass. Of course, it was only a matter of time before all this filth, this daily contact with waste, blood, frost, worms, and open wounds, began to rot people not just from the outside in, but from the inside out. Because when excrement is everywhere, on hands, under fingernails, in water buckets, in cooking pots, on sleeping straw, then disease doesn't spread, it blooms. Let's start with the basics. Protozoan parasites, like Giardia and Entamoeba histolytica, made themselves at home in the guts of nearly every living person. They burrowed deep into intestines, rupturing tissue, stealing nutrients, causing diarrhea so violent that people wasted away in days, clutching their bellies as their bodies collapsed from starvation, even while they kept eating. Children cried blood. Adults soiled themselves in public and died on doorsteps. And no one thought it strange. It was just life. And then there was dysentery, a word you've probably heard but have never truly understood. It wasn't just a bad stomach. It was a slow, internal drowning. Your bowels liquefied. You lost all control. Your skin shriveled from dehydration. Your lips cracked open, and your fever burned so high that many began to hallucinate, screaming at shadows, clawing at their own skin, seeing devils in the rafters. Some died curled around latrine holes, others drowned in their own fluids, and there were no graves, just piles. But the filth didn't stop at the gut. People went blind from eye infections caused by flies breeding in latrines, deaf from boils that ruptured behind the ears, mute from fungal infections that rotted the tongue. Whole towns smelled of necrotic flesh. Hospitals? They were often just shared rooms with buckets. Doctors? Barbers with knives and herbs. Healing? Mostly, they bled you, because if your body was sick, it clearly had too much blood in it. Makes sense, right? And then came the Black Death. History books will tell you it came from fleas on rats. And sure, that's technically true. But those fleas got there because people ate beside their own shit, drank water that dripped through corpses, and shared sponges with a dozen strangers who hadn't bathed in years. It wasn't the rats. It was the ritualized normalization of filth. In just 5 years, the plague killed up to 60% of Europe's population. Entire villages disappeared without a scream. Farms turned to dust. Markets emptied. Fathers buried daughters. Priests burned books. And all of it started with what we now flush and forget. Because in a world without toilets, soap, running water, or even the idea that wiping mattered, the real plague wasn't microbial. It was cultural. And the most tragic part, they thought this was how life was supposed to be. They didn't know they were living in a slow apocalypse. They just knew that every morning, someone else didn't wake up. And no one asked why, because everyone already knew. You'd think that in the middle of all this decay, this constant dance between excrement and infection, someone would have figured out how to treat the consequences. But medieval medicine wasn't medicine. It was a chaotic mess of trial, error, and prayer, soaked in bloodletting, superstition, and bodily fluids no one bothered to name correctly. If your stomach hurt, it meant you had excess heat in the bowels. If your stool was black, it meant your soul had been shadowed by sin. If you bled for more than a few days after childbirth, they dunked your feet in cold water and burned herbs by your head. Why? Because they believed the womb could crawl into the lungs and choke you. Yes, wandering womb syndrome. That was a real diagnosis. Treatments for toilet-related illness were just as deranged. For hemorrhoids, you were strapped to a bench and your protruding veins were burned shut with hot iron rods. For anal fissures, boiled wine was poured directly onto the wound, while you were held down by 4 men. For intestinal worms, you were fed a mixture of crushed garlic, pig bile, and powdered lead, and then told to squat over a steaming bowl of vinegar to steam the demons out. But if that didn't work, well, it was clearly the devil, so the priest was called in. That's when treatment turned to exorcism. People were dragged to church floors, sweating and shaking, while monks chanted over their blistered bodies, demanding demons exit through the bowels. Sometimes the afflicted would convulse and defecate on the altar, and the clergy took this as a sign that God was near. Leeches were common, not for blood pressure, no one knew what that was, but for balance, because bad blood needed to be drained, and the anus was considered one of the body's sacred vents. Yes, many would bled rectally. You sat over a basin while someone slit a vein inside your lower back. Some fainted, some died, but the smell stayed. They bled children, pregnant women, the elderly, sometimes on the same table, with the same blade, wiped once on someone's sleeve. Surgery was rare, and when it was done, it was without anesthetic. Just bite down on leather or scream until you pass out. They weren't healing bodies, they were guessing with knives, and they guessed wrong, a lot. Because medicine back then wasn't about cleanliness or science or care. It was about purging the filth, not understanding it. And if you suffered in the process, that was just God's will, squeezing the rot out of your soul. Could you survive that world? Or would that world have swallowed you whole? Let me know in the comments. Because history doesn't just live in books. Sometimes it lives under your fingernails.